So that was a good introduction. So I saw Vibhav giving an introduction about AI and touching some of the ethics concept, and Hazel really getting into what are the implications of having ethical issues in AI. I will try to get into the next level, which is, yes, there are so many ethical issues in AI. We are building more models, implementing more models. Now, how do we go about addressing these ethical issues? That's going to be my focus of discussion. So I'm not going to go into this detail, just, it has been introduced already. So I'm going to skip this section. So how do we address bias in AI? So yes, there is bias. We know that we don't want bias to be creeping into the AI systems, but what do we do? How do we address the bias? I'll just move this thing down. Okay. All right. So organizations, they have a lot of steps that the AI developers or who are implementing the AI models take in order to make sure that the bias is not creeping into the system. Now, I've highlighted some 12 steps here that you could do while you're building the models to mitigate these ethics, AI bias issues. Again, bias in AI cannot be completely, you can completely get rid of it, but there is definitely steps you can do to minimize the risk it poses. So first, what we can do is create a framework. So what the organizations, companies do is they actually create a framework where it clearly articulates to all the people who are developing the AI models, how to get the data, what are the things you need to look at while you're building the models and implementing the models. You need to have a clear framework that everybody sort of follows that framework. It's not only for people who are building the models and operationalizing the models, but also people who are indirectly impacted. So everyone should have a clear view of how the organization goes through the activity of developing models and implementing them in their system for decisioning. Next thing we should be mindful of is be aware of impact to people. So Hazel did an excellent job of highlighting some of the impacts that can have to people if the AI prediction goes wrong. Now, for example, to reiterate, if your AI prediction is to recommend a movie and that goes wrong, yes, it's the wrong decision, but it is okay. We can correct it. But if you are having another model where your prediction is to identify whether a particular person has got a disease or not, and if that is not predicted, and it can go serious consequences relating to death of the person. So when you are building AI models, you have to always take a risk-based approach. If the risk is higher, then you need to make sure you follow all the steps and have the right due diligence to make sure, they're not impacted. So when you build the model, be aware who is this decision going to impact and what the impact will be and how serious, and based on that, you'll have to have additional controls. Examine the input data. As Vibhav has mentioned before, AI starts with data, right? So when you are building an AI model, of course, the model is to address a particular business objective or a problem or a challenge. Now, you need to make sure that the data that you chose should be relevant to the business problem that you're trying to achieve. And you also need to ask a few questions about the data. Is the data available? Is the data accessible? Is the data has got any constraints, such as, it has got personal identifiable information that you should not be accessing it? Or am I going to breach my privacy issues by actually including that data into my model? And what about the quality of the data? As it's very known in the industry that data scientists spend almost 80% of their time to actually massage and make the data ready before they can feed into the models. So you need to make sure that the quality of the data that you use is good, so that you can save time, and then the models can predict accurately. So once you have the right data, then you have to train the model with these data. What you should be mindful when you're actually training the data that is going into the model is, again, bias. You need to make sure that the data is diverse. It is fully representative of the population for what this model is meant to. It should not be skewed to a particular community, race, or a gender, which will lead to further bias. So you need to be very mindful and make sure you have diversity in your data. Next thing is using synthetic data. So one of the things with data, so while we have said this data is very important to AI, it is not always the case that we are able to get the data that we want. As I highlighted previously, the data is not of good quality, so I may not be able to use it. It is restricted, or it doesn't have the diverse data input that we need to actually use it in my algorithm. So what these days the organizations are doing is actually coming up with the synthetic data. Synthetic data is nothing but artificially created data, which has the traits, features, and characteristics of the production data, but you're not using production data. So in a way, you are able to use as much data as possible. You can actually generate the diversity you need in the data so that the algorithms are able to predict more accurately. The next thing you need to be mindful of is check the bias in AI algorithm. Now, your data may be good, you've trained everything, all of that is good, but even then, bias can creep in at any stage of the AI development life cycle, during the design of the algorithm, building of the algorithm, or even during the testing phase of the algorithm. So you have to make sure you're continuously check that bias is not consciously or unconsciously creeping into the system. The next thing you need to do is test, and retest. I cannot reiterate it enough. So what we need to do is, when you've got the model ready and you want to test it, make sure you test it with different test data, varied test data. You make sure you test it with different environments and analyze the different outputs that are produced by these. So by doing this, you are actually able to understand the weaknesses your AI system has, and you can constantly enhance them to make sure it is able to predict accurately. The next thing you need to be mindful of is transparency and interpretability. Transparency means that when any issues are in the decision, you can all go backtrack and find out where the root cause of the issue was, and then you can address it. Interpretability. This is where you should be able to explain the models, how the decision has been made. So often the algorithms are black box, which means there are sophisticated algorithm that runs behind the scene, which actually makes a decision. So you need to be able to have some explainable area, other concepts to be able to explain why a decision was made. If you are rejecting a loan for a particular individual based on an AI algorithm, why you came to that conclusion, you need to be able to provide the reasons for that. Have an ethical committee. So this is very important. Organizations are emphasizing on that. So you need to have a governance body. They will be represented by different experts from different fields who come together, who review the AI system, who ask the right questions and approve the models before going into the production. Automation, the detection of bias. This is a very interesting concept. There are some organizations where if you're having large scale models, thousands and thousands of models, can we automate the detection of bias, which means can the AI itself detect a bias in it and then correct it itself. So that's what automate detection of bias is, but it is very, very early stages, a bit challenging because there is always a human element of expertise is required to identify bias. Keep records on the decision. So while you have built the model and implemented the model into production, you still have to keep a record of every decision that has been made, why that's been made. So any issues, you can always go back and make sure you know who made the decision and how it was made. Finally, be prepared. As I mentioned earlier, it is not possible to get rid of bias completely, but all of these steps will help you to minimize it. But even then, sometimes bias can creep into the production systems. So you need to be prepared. You need to have a plan of action. You need to be immediately be able to have to stop the models, go back to the people who are impacted, have some things to actually address the issue. So these are some of the general steps that people who build algorithms, organization go through rigorously to make sure that they can mitigate the bias in the algorithm as much as possible. Now, we talked about addressing bias and what steps we need to take. I just wanted to go a little bit higher, and then because AI is becoming everywhere and it's going to be used every industry and it's going to touch everyone's life, the organizations who are building it should have a okay, so what I say, okay, so what I was saying is that so these are all some unique problems only for artificial intelligence. We don't have policies or guidelines that we can go back and refer to. So that is why it becomes all the more important for the organizations to be more responsible in the way they develop and implement AI. So in terms of the definition, what is responsible AI? It means you designing and building systems that act responsibly towards human beings. You know, it must be responsible, trustworthy, reliable, robust, accountable, and transparent, which all the concepts I think Hazel alluded to, and Weber as well. So how do an organization become a responsible AI organization? There are two main perspectives you need to look at. One is the ethical side of the AI, other one is explainable AI. So ethical AI broadly covers topics such as fair and inclusive, you know, accountable for its own decision, and not discriminating certain population against others. Whereas explainable AI, which this is around how are you able to explain the accuracy of the model, how are you able to explain why the model made that particular decision. You should be able to, for the auditors, this refers to they have the ability to test the model so they can approve it. For decision makers, they should be able to have a transparent model that they can confidently trust on the model. So these are all the two aspects that the organization need to look at when they're building a responsible AI organization. So just going through a little bit in detail. So what are the principles of ethical AI? You know, accountability. You know, we need to make sure the team or the individual who is actually designing, building, and implementing AI must also be responsible and accountable for the decisions that comes out of the AI, right? So organizations these days, they are having governance bodies, ethical committees who would make sure that these models are not having any bias, they're not going to harm any human or individuals, and they make sure and they approve it. So that's on the accountability side. Inclusiveness is about making sure when you build an algorithm, you include everyone in the algorithm, the person who is building this. So one thing I wanted to highlight is when you're actually building the algorithm, the bias can creep in two ways. One is the data. If it is not diverse, if it is not inclusive, then you would have bias getting into the algorithm. The other way you can get bias is if the people who are at workforce, which is building those algorithms, if they are not diverse, then you will still have bias influence in building those models. So inclusiveness is very important. There are challenges. Women is underrepresented in AI. Minority communities is underrepresented AI. So organizations are doing a lot of activities, even AI communities, MKAI is a great example. They are having inclusive AI, having everybody to be participate in this AI journey. The other one, reliability and safety. We need to make sure the AI that has been built and implemented is reliable and safe. Reliable in the sense we make sure that when you build the model, it is meant to predict certain things. When you implement them in production, as time goes, there is a tendency for the model to lose its accuracy. So you need to continuously monitor the models to make sure if it is not accurately predicting what it was meant to predict, you got to go back to your drawing board, go to the development team and ask them to refine the models. Safety, make sure when you're building AI systems, the safety standards has been met, such that there is no vulnerabilities where people can hack into and make changes to the predictions. So these are all some of the ethical side of the AI, the key principles that you need to keep in mind. From an explainability perspective, we've gone through in detail. Fairness, make sure it is fair for everyone, not to a particular community. Transparent, make sure you are able to know what, if there anything goes wrong, you know where it gone wrong and who did it and how can I fix it. Privacy and security, yes, make sure that you don't breach any privacy or security concerns. You follow these security standards and policies, compliance standards. All of them needs to be sort of taken into consideration when all of these constitutes together in building a responsible AI organization. The final thing I wanted to leave is that you might have process technologies and frameworks and everything, but without people, nothing happens. So organizations need to emphasize on educating the people, awareness on AI, educating them on what is AI, and then also educating them on responsible AI. So they know what, when AI system is built, what is the implications to people who are decision is being made based on that. So people is an important factor and need to make sure people are on board. That's my closing note. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to present. It was a pleasure.